Among all the questions our time forces upon us, there is one that almost no one has the courage to ask directly, and the answer is going to surprise people who have never stopped to consider it. The question is this: when Europe and Africa use the same words, rights, dignity, health, family, are they actually talking about the same thing? A few days ago, that question was not raised by a politician in an op-ed or a think tank paper. It was raised by a cardinal, in an unexpected setting, the floor of the European Parliament in Brussels, and not just any cardinal. Cardinal Robert Sarah is African, a son of Guinea, a man who grew up under a dictatorship that persecuted the faith, who watched churches closed and priests harassed by a Marxist regime that treated religious conviction as a threat to state authority. He is not speaking from theory. He is speaking from a village where missionaries first brought the gospel, from a life that passed through colonialism, through independence, and through a dictatorship that tried to extinguish what independence had made possible. He knows, in a way that few people in that Brussels chamber could claim to know, the difference between genuine help offered freely and control disguised as generosity. By the end of this video, you will understand why questions that sound abstract on the surface conceal a precise and specific accusation, and why Cardinal Sarah looked the European Parliament in the eye, inside its own chamber, and said, "You are doing it again." Begin with the surface, with what appears self-evidently good. Europe helps Africa. It sends funds. It signs agreements. It finances development projects across the continent. What could possibly be wrong with that? It looks like pure generosity, the wealthy continent extending a hand to the continent still working to build its infrastructure and its economy. That is exactly how the story is normally told, in development reports and diplomatic communiques and news coverage that treats European aid to Africa as an unambiguous good, requiring no further scrutiny. Sarah asks his audience to pause and pose the first uncomfortable question. Is that aid actually free? Or does it arrive with hidden conditions attached? Because European funds, the Cardinal states directly, are frequently tied to a specific agenda. To receive support, an African nation must accept certain reforms. And those reforms travel under names carefully chosen to sound beyond reproach. Sexual and reproductive health, gender equality. Who could possibly object to language framed in those terms? And here comes Sarah's second and deeper question. What do those words actually mean in practice? Because behind the phrase reproductive health, the Cardinal observes, there frequently hides a practice directed against the lives of children not yet born. And behind gender equality, what is often actually being introduced is the entire ideological framework of gender theory, a framework that goes far beyond the straightforward moral claim that men and women deserve equal dignity and equal rights. The words say one thing. The content imposed under those words does something else entirely. Can we still understand each other? Sarah asked the assembled parliamentarians. Do the words we use, rights, dignity, development, freedom, health, gender, family, still mean the same thing in Brussels as they do in Kampala or in Conakry? The question sounds almost linguistic, almost academic. It is not. It is a blade. Because if the same words mean opposite things depending on who is speaking them, then dialogue between the parties using those words is not real dialogue. It is a performance of understanding that conceals its absence. One side believes agreement has been reached, the other side has agreed to something it did not actually understand, or has been maneuvered into accepting terms it would have rejected if they had been stated plainly. And here the Cardinal descends to a level that almost no one in that chamber was prepared to hear named. This ambiguity, he said, is not an accident. It is deliberate. The words are chosen precisely because they sound good, because their surface meaning is unobjectionable, and because that surface meaning conceals what, if stated openly, many Africans would refuse. The incoherence between word and content is not a failure of communication, it is the intended design. And here the argument turns towards something that should concern every person listening, regardless of where they live. Because what Sarah is describing as an export toward Africa is the identical method that has been operating for years inside the West itself, and by now, inside the Church. It is the model that hollows out a word and refills it with different content. Family, which no longer means father, mother, and children in the way it meant for the entirety of human history until a few decades ago. Love, deployed as a justification broad enough to cover almost anything. And even inside the Church, a new word repeated everywhere: synodality, which almost no one can actually define with precision. Cardinal Burke said as much just days earlier. There is no definition of synodality, he stated plainly. There is no history of synodality in the Church. It is the same technique. A vague and reassuring word deployed to smuggle through a change that, stated openly, many of the faithful would reject. And the fruits of this model are already visible to anyone willing to look honestly at them. Where it has been applied across Europe and North America, it has not produced unity, but division. Not peace, but confusion. Not full churches, but empty pews. This is exactly what Sarah fears for his own continent today. And this is why his warning is not a distant matter belonging to another continent's business. It is a mirror. When he tells Europe, "You are doing it again," he is also describing what the West has been doing to itself for a considerable time already. These are not merely rhetorical accusations offered without evidence. In support of Sarah's intervention, the organizers of the event presented a dossier documenting how the European Union deploys financial, legal, and commercial instruments to advance specific agendas across Africa. Not generic accusations, documentation. Because a continent that remains deeply religious, deeply attached to family, and to the protection of life, would never openly accept what is being imposed on it under a different name. And so persuasion is attempted through language, and where language fails, compliance is secured through money. This is why Sarah reaches for a phrase with real historical weight: ideological colonization. Europe once colonized Africa with ships and rifles. Today, he says, it does so with trade agreements and development aid. Yesterday, goods were exported and borders were imposed by force. Today, ideas are exported and laws are imposed through financial leverage. The instruments have changed. The underlying logic of domination has not. And here is the sentence that carries more weight than any other in his address. You are doing it again. This is not an accusation thrown out carelessly. It is the diagnosis of an African man who recognizes, underneath the contemporary vocabulary of rights and development, the old face of the colonial master, dressed now in the language of humanitarian concern rather than the language of civilizing mission, but operating according to the same fundamental structure. Someone with resources decides, on behalf of a people who did not ask to be decided for, what that people's future should look like. And the resources are made conditional on acceptance of that decision. Pause here, because the paradox is enormous and deserves to be stated in its full weight. The institution that presents itself as the great champion of freedom and human rights is, according to Sarah, the very institution failing to respect the most elementary freedom of all. The freedom of a people to remain what it is, to define its own family structures according to its own moral and religious convictions, to raise its own children according to the faith it has received, rather than according to a framework negotiated in Brussels and attached as a condition to a development fund. And here a further and even more uncomfortable question opens. If this were genuinely about freedom, why would aid be tied to conditions at all? Freedom, by its very nature, is not something that can be imposed. It can only be offered. Whatever is imposed, by definition, has already ceased to be freedom and has become something else, something closer to its opposite. A people, Sarah said, has the right to live, to preserve, and to transmit its own religious and family culture, exactly as every individual person has the right to profess their own faith without external coercion. This is a total reversal of the framework that usually governs these conversations. The real intolerance, the Cardinal suggests, is not the intolerance of an Africa defending its faith and its traditional family structures against external pressure. The real intolerance belongs to a Europe that can no longer tolerate the existence of people who think differently than it does. And perhaps, at the deepest level of all, this is because those who have lost something cannot bear the sight of those who still possess it. And Africa still possesses what Europe has largely misplaced: faith, children, a living sense of the sacred that has not yet been argued or legislated or educated out of ordinary life. Before going further, honesty requires a qualification that Sarah himself would insist on, because the case he makes is strongest when it is not overstated. Not all European aid is poisoned. This needs to be said plainly and held on to throughout everything that follows. Many people working within European institutions, within humanitarian organizations, within the development agencies that channel funds toward African nations, offer that help in complete and unqualified good faith. Their motivation is not ideological colonization. It is a genuine desire to see children stop dying of preventable diseases, to see maternal mortality rates fall, to see schools built and roads paved and clean water reach villages that have gone without it for generations. It would be a serious injustice, and frankly, a betrayal of the honesty this channel tries to maintain, to paint every act of cooperation between Europe and Africa as a conspiracy orchestrated by cynical bureaucrats intent on cultural domination. Development work of this kind has saved lives, measurably and verifiably. Vaccination campaigns funded by European partnerships have reduced childhood mortality. Agricultural programs have improved food security in regions that once faced regular famine. Educational investment has opened universities and vocational schools to young Africans whose parents had no such opportunities. None of this should be minimized or waved away in the service of a tidier narrative. And Africa itself, it must also be said clearly, is not a paradise to be defended uncritically in every particular. The continent carries its own deep wounds, many of them entirely unconnected to European interference. Corruption within some African governments has diverted resources meant for the poor into the hands of the already powerful. Ethnic and religious conflicts have produced suffering on a scale that dwarfs anything attributable to a Brussels funding condition. Internal governance failures, not external ideological pressure, explain a great deal of the continent's continuing struggles. No serious account of Africa's situation should romanticize it as a unified, unblemished civilization, standing nobly against a corrupting West. That picture would be as dishonest, in its own way, as the picture Sarah is pushing back against. But having said all of that, having granted every legitimate qualification that fairness demands, the point Sarah raises in that Brussels chamber survives intact. It does not depend on aid being universally malicious to be true. It depends on something narrower and more precise. That whoever gives with one hand must not use the other hand to dictate conscience. That principle holds regardless of how much of the total aid relationship is conducted in good faith. Even if 90% of European assistance to Africa carries no ideological strings whatsoever, the 10% that does, the funding explicitly conditioned on the adoption of specific policies regarding reproduction, family structure, or gender, represents a violation of a principle that should never be negotiable, regardless of how small a percentage of the overall relationship it constitutes. This is precisely why Cardinal Sarah stood before the European parliamentarians and asked them directly for something specific and concrete. Not an end to cooperation, not a withdrawal of European engagement with the African continent. He asked for a cooperation that is genuinely free, uncoupled from ideological agendas that have nothing to do with the practical development goals the aid claims to serve. Help generously, he seemed to be saying. Help with the full measure of resources that a wealthy continent can extend to a continent still building its infrastructure. But do not attach to that help conditions that require the abandonment of convictions a community did not choose to have challenged as the price of a well, a clinic, or an agricultural subsidy. Now return to the question this video opened with, the question that at first sounded almost too simple to carry the weight Sarah placed on it. Do the same words still mean the same thing when Brussels speaks them and when Kampala or Conakry hears them? Sarah's answer, delivered inside the very chamber where those words are drafted into policy and attached to funding agreements, is no. But it is essential to understand what kind of no this is. It is not a cardinal throwing up his hands in despair, declaring that meaningful communication across cultures and continents has become permanently impossible. It is something else. It is an invitation, a call to rediscover the actual weight that words are meant to carry before that weight is lost entirely. An invitation for dignity to mean, again, without qualification or footnote, respect for human life from its beginning to its natural end. An invitation for family to mean, again, what it has meant across every culture and every civilization for the overwhelming majority of human history, before the last several decades of Western social experimentation began hollowing the word out from the inside. Father, mother, children. An invitation for freedom to include, explicitly and without exception, the freedom to believe, to worship according to that belief, and to raise the next generation within it, without a funding body on another continent treating that belief as an obstacle standing between a community and the resources it needs to survive. Because when words lose their actual content, something far more consequential than vocabulary dies with them. Truth itself becomes structurally unreachable. And once truth becomes unreachable through language, the very possibility of two human beings actually understanding one another collapses, even as both continue speaking, even as both continue nodding across a negotiating table, even as agreements continue to be signed and photographed and announced as successes. A conversation conducted in words that carry opposite meanings for each party is not a conversation in any meaningful sense. It is two separate monologues performed in close physical proximity, each side walking away convinced that understanding was reached, when in fact, nothing was actually communicated at all. The agreement signed under those conditions is not a meeting of minds. It is a transaction in which one party understood the terms and the other party accepted a translation that concealed them. This, in its fullest sense, is the battle that an elderly African cardinal traveled to the heart of Europe to fight. And it matters enormously to understand precisely what kind of battle this was, because it would be a serious misreading, one that Sarah himself would likely reject, to describe his intervention as an attack against Europe as such. It was not that. It was something more demanding and, in its own way, more generous. It was a battle for Europe's own soul, waged by a man who came not as a conqueror seeking advantage, but as someone reminding a continent of something it appears to have forgotten about its own identity. It was faith, once, that made Europe what it became. The cathedrals that still define the skylines of its great cities did not build themselves. The universities that produced its scientists, its philosophers, its jurists, grew directly out of monasteries where monks preserved learning through centuries when nothing else in the surrounding world preserved it. The entire civilizational inheritance that Europe now exports, sometimes generously and sometimes as a condition attached to a loan, is an inheritance that flowed originally from a conviction the continent has been steadily setting aside for the better part of the last 100 years. Sarah's own life carries this history inside it directly. The missionaries who brought the gospel to his village in Guinea were themselves products of that same European Christian civilization, sent outward at a time when Europe still believed unambiguously in what it was transmitting. Sarah did not travel to Brussels as an adversary of the continent that once colonized his own homeland through very different and far more brutal means. He went as something considerably more complicated and, if his critics would allow it, more generous than an adversary. He went as a man offering Europe a mirror, at real personal and institutional cost, in the sincere hope that what the mirror reflects back might still be recognized by those looking into it, and might still prompt a different choice than the one the continent's institutions currently appear committed to making. The final question of this video, then, does not belong to Cardinal Sarah. He has already asked his question and offered his answer with more courage than most men holding his rank would risk. The question now belongs to whoever has followed this argument to its end. When you hear those words, dignity, rights, health, family, freedom, spoken in the confident and reassuring cadence of institutional and diplomatic language, do you ever pause to ask what has actually been concealed beneath them? Because learning to ask that question again, consistently, without cynicism but also without naivety, may be the first and most necessary defense against a colonization that no longer requires ships or rifles to accomplish its purpose. A colonization that arrives instead through language, quietly emptied of its inherited content and refilled with something else entirely, offered as a gift whose conditions were never spoken aloud until the moment the signature was already required. What do you think? Leave a comment below. Amen. God bless you.